Hi, so today I'm going to show you a few different binding methods. So the first one I'm going to show you is the flat binding method that we use in the Grainger Coat for binding the seams. So here's some fabric that I quilted earlier, and I've sewn just, a fake seam there. And it's a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So to make this nice and flat, what we're going to do is we're going to use what I'm calling like a flat binding. I'm going to sew it in cream so you can see it, but of course you'd use a matching thread. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim back one of the seam allowances. So if I want to press the seam allowances over to this side like that, then I'm going to trim the seam allowance that's the one that's going to end up underneath. So I'm just holding the other one out of the way there, and I'm just trimming it back, about halfway. Okay. And then I have some 1-inch wide bias binding here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this bias binding onto the other seam allowance like this. So what I would recommend is actually opening up the binding. I'm just gonna cut it off so it's a bit easier to manage. Open up one side of the binding, and you're just gonna sew it to that seam allowance, just making sure that when you sew it, when it turns back, it's going to be just a little ways away from the stitching line like that. You don't want to like overlap it. So what you can do is actually hold it like that and just see how far away it is approximately from that edge there. And then I'm just going to sew it down right in that crease line. Okay, and I'm just kind of checking. So there's that stitching line, and then when I fold it back, you can see that it's just a distance away there. So then I'm going to open up that seam and press everything over to this side like that. Okay, so right now on the right side, you can just see that seam line. After we sew it, you'll see another line of stitching from where we do the flat binding. At this point you could give it a press. I'm not going to bother just because it's a demo. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin stitch or edge stitch just along this edge here. Just holding it over. If it were pressed, it would be sitting really flat. And that's all there is to it. So on the right side, you'll see that you end up with another row of stitching, kind of like a top stitching, just a ways away from your seam line. That's not a problem because it's already quilted, so you'll already have that look, and if the thread is like blending in, it will look quite nice actually. And then on the inside, you end up with a lovely flat finish. If you use everything matching or complementary, you could even wear your coat inside out. You could have it reversible. Once that's pressed, it'll be nice and flat and give a lovely clean finish. So that's the flat binding technique. Let's move on to a couple of different methods for binding the edges. So in the Grainger Coat pattern, it gives you the option of using either bias binding or twill tape. So this is bias binding. I'm going to show you how I do it. There's lots of different methods to bind a seam. One of the methods is to use double fold bias tape, fold it in half and just machine it on. That's actually very similar to the twill tape binding I'm going to do. So I'm just going to do a classic bias binding, and I'm going to machine stitch it on both passes. So if you would prefer to hand stitch it on, that's great too. So if you're going to hand stitch or machine stitch, it will depend which side you're going to sew the bias on the first time. So this is the right side of the fabric. If I'm going to hand stitch, I'm going to sew the binding on to the right side first, turn it over the edge, and then hand stitch it on the wrong side. Obviously this would have a lining already, but I'm just showing you on this scrap. And that's because you would end up with a very clean edge on the outside. If you're going to machine it down for the second pass, you're going to do the opposite and sew it to the wrong side first, so that after you flip it over the edge, you're going to be edge stitching or pin stitching on the right side of the garment, and that just makes it a little bit easier you don't have to worry about catching the new edge or anything. So the procedure is the same whether you're edge stitching with a machine or hand stitching. It's just which side you start on. So I'm going to machine this on. So I'm going to I'm just going to open out one side of the bias tape and match that up with the edge of the fabric. So this would be the edge of your coat. I'm just going to sew right in that crease line. You can see I've gotten a little bit wonky with my bias making there. I'm just going to kind of correct that as I go. This is homemade bias tape. I prefer to use homemade if I can, just because you can use nicer fabrics. Sorry. Then from here, you're going to fold this over to the right side, and you will give it a press. So you'll fold it over the edge, give it a press there, over there, and then edge stitch or pin stitch down. Okay. I just actually moved my needle over, so I'm running my, this is a Benina, and on this particular foot, I'm just running the edge of the bias tape down this inner edge of the foot. Each sewing machine is going to be slightly different. I found that works on this machine, but I just have to click the needle over like one stop. And then I'm just going to edge stitch. Edge stitch or pin stitch, it's the same thing. You can certainly hand baste this first before doing this, or pin it. And I'm just actually using my eye to make sure the binding is an even width all the way down. And that's that finished binding there. Of course, normally you would use a matching colored thread, but I just wanted to show you what it will look like. So that's one method. Another suggestion is to use twill tape. So I'm just going to cut a piece to length. I've taken my twill tape and I have pressed it in half. So I think this is 1 inch wide twill tape. I've just pressed it in half, trying to be as exact as I can. If you're using bias tape and you'd prefer to sew it on in one pass, you can also use double fold bias tape or pre-fold your bias in half like this. So that would work too, and the procedure for applying it would be the same. If I'm using bias tape, I prefer to use the previous method personally. Okay, so now what you're going to do is open up your twill tape and just sandwich it in there. Now there's a little bit of bulk to the fabric because it's quilted. So when I fold it over, this side is going to end up slightly this way compared to the back. It's not going to match up precisely, but as long as we catch the back, it's fine. Okay. So again, you might want to hand baste this or definitely pin it. I'm just machining using that edge as a guide again. So that's what the right side looks like, and then the wrong side, there's always a little bit more hanging over on the wrong side, which is fine. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to miter some corners now. So the procedure is a little bit different depending on if you're using the bias tape or the twill tape. So I'll do the twill tape first, just because that's what I have out, and then I'll show you the bias tape method. So if you're doing the double fold bias method, then you would do this same way. So you would sew your twill tape on just as usual. Okay, and if this is the corner that I want to miter, I'm just going to sew all the way flush with this edge. Okay, very important that you go all the way to even with that edge. Okay, just going to back tack a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to trim my threads off. So I'm just going to fold it back neatly so that to form a miter like this. And it sometimes helps to put a little hand stitch in or to pop a pin in. Let's see. So basically you want to get this as clear as you can, this corner, so just you'd press it in and then resume your stitching. And sew your second side. And when that's pressed, it'll form a really nice miter. So that's one method. So the first thing I'm going to do is sew it on as usual, just for the first side. So just machining it on. I'm just going to stop a little bit short of this end, so just where I would turn, so about whatever the width of this part of the bias tape is, I'm just going to stop about there. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the bias tape up at a 45-degree angle with that angle matching that corner, and then back down again. Okay, like this. And then I'm going to sew the second side, starting right at the very edge. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to flip it over. The last video turned out too blurry, so I hope this one's going to focus. So you can see it's formed a beautiful mitered corner there. I'm going to flip it to the other side. Fold this first side down, and I'm going to just finger press that angle in there and then fold it back on itself, forming a beautiful miter on this side, or you can do it the other way, this way, folding this one up, pressing this to 45, then folding this one down, matching that inside corner. I'm just going to pop a pin in it. Okay, now I'm going to just pin stitch it down. It's very hard to sew with a camera in between you and your work. Let's see if I can do it without falling off the edge. Not certain I can. Can't see where to turn. I think that's it. There we go. So there's your perfectly mitered corner. Hope that helped.